Hello, it's Jeta, and today I wanted to talk about how I revised for English Literature A-level, basically give you all of my tips and advice on how I got an A star. It is really hot today and I can't open the window because it's really loud outside because there's some building work going on, so do bear with me because I feel very hot and sweaty. But yes, I am going to get straight into it, and just quickly to preface, I did the EduCAS exam board for English, so the things that I say might differ slightly in terms of how your exams are laid out, but the basic premise is obviously going to be the same, like learning quotes and context and poetry versus plays. So yes, I thought I would start with poetry, my favourite part of the course, but for me I did Plath and Hughes poetry, which was the comparison essay, and then I also had to do Paradise Lost by John Milton, which was the sort of longer singular analysis of the poetry book. Also quickly, my poetry paper was an open book paper, so I didn't need to know the quotes off by heart, but obviously a deep understanding of the quotes was essential for this paper still. And I think with poetry, the first thing to do is just read the poems again and again and again. Read through them, annotate them with your own thoughts as well as the class notes that you made. Actually, if you're stuck with annotation, I would recommend Genius. It's this website where people have annotated poems and song pieces and all sorts of literature, but I sometimes found it quite helpful for very niche annotation ideas. Do be careful when using this. A lot of the annotations aren't authorized or anything, they're just random people's thoughts, but I did find a few quite useful, so I will link that resource down below if you want to use it. Specifically for Plath and Hughes, we had to pair up poems in the essays, so I did this pre-hand before the exam. I went through all the different poems and paired up the ones that made most sense together. And then specifically for Plath and Hughes, once I matched up all of the poems, I would make these sort of essay plans in a way, these grids. So I'd have the sort of statement or question, so this was sort of violence and how both of the poets show violence of the world. And I'd have one poem here, so Daddy, and then the other poem here, so Love Song. And then I'd have the outline of both poems, overall comparisons, so how the poems are similar and different overall without going into the nitty-gritty yet. Then I'd have quotes and a bit of analysis, and these quotes I'd try to pair them up if possible to have like more in-depth comparisons. Then I'd have context for both poems, and then critics, so any critics quotes that I thought, oh, that links really well. I just have those there too, and I did these for loads of the poems. I did it for relationships as well, with Morning Song and Full Moon and Little Frida, and I did the same thing. And I actually ended up using these exact essay plans, like the exact comparisons, because even if the question isn't exactly what you planned, the comparisons you can use are very similar. You just have to sort of change it a little bit to fit with the question. And then for Paradise Lost, I would be lying if I said I did a lot of revision for this. I think this was the one part of English that I decided to sort of just wing, which didn't actually turn up so well for me in the exam, because this was the essay that I ran out of time for and ended up only writing half an essay in the exam, and I really don't understand how this didn't cost me the grade, but apparently it was still fine. But what I did do is print out another copy of Paradise Lost, because it's a very long epic poem. We were just looking at book 9, but I printed out again like a blank copy and went through all of it by myself and analysed everything all over again with a fresh head, and this definitely helped because it meant that the poem was fresher in my mind. And also, this was so hard. Like the first time that we read it as a class, I had no idea what was going on. But the second time reading it helped so much, because I feel like when I analysed it, I actually understood what I was analysing rather than just sort of going with the flow with the class. So I would really highly recommend reading and analysing your texts for the second time around by yourself, but also just printing out like a new copy for poetry and reading it again by yourself. Now moving on to plays, this was a closed book exam for me, so I did need to know quotes. Again with the plays, read them more than once, just like with the poetry, but I think with the plays this is even more important. I did A Streetcar Named Desire, A Duchess of Malfi and Hamlet, and I think I read each text 3 times. I think maybe Hamlet only twice, only because we read it towards the end of the year. But I would say first read it obviously with your class and then read it 2 more times after that. I sort of paced myself and essentially read it the second time before my mocks and then the third time before my A-levels. So before learning quotes for the plays, what I did do is make these scene by scene summaries. So act, scene by scene essentially. So this is the one I made for Hamlet. This is really helpful because one of the questions I had was an extract question for Hamlet, and you need to know where the extract is placed in the play because that kind of gets you a few extra marks if you mention that in your introduction. So this was really, really helpful for that question. And also just knowing the plot in general is definitely going to help you with learning quotes as well. A little niche tip as well is sometimes just learn the quotes from the soliloquies because those can be really easy to learn, but also it means that you can talk about a chunk of the play without having to learn like little bitty quotes from all over the place. And they're really easy to mention and talk about, and obviously they're also really important. So I also made a little soliloquy summary page for Hamlet too. In terms of the quotes themselves, I did make quote notes, so I just made a list of scene by scene all of the quotes that I wanted to learn. Obviously these are so many and I did not remember all of these, but this helped with just a baseline of quotes that are usable and quite good. And at first I was actually using this. I did not do it closed book. When I'd plan essays I'd use this list, but the more time went on, the more you start just kind of knowing the quotes. And in terms of how I actually tested myself is that I would make mind map essay plans. So I'd have like madness in Hamlet, and then I'd just try and remember as many quotes as possible, add in critics, context, analysis. This isn't the best essay mind map I've done, but it's just the one that I found. I made loads of those though, and they really, really helped with memorizing quotes. Sometimes, as well as doing those mind maps, I'd verbally say the essay plans. So I kind of either explain it to myself or someone else. So let's say I was planning a essay about revenge in Hamlet, I would just say out as many quotes as I could remember regarding revenge, and this also really helped. So those were mainly for Hamlet, and then for A Streetcar Named Desire and The Duchess of Malfi, that was a comparison essay, and I learned the quotes slightly differently. I actually made these flashcards where I would have a quote from the Duchess on one side and then a quote from Streetcar on the other side that directly linked. And these were so helpful because it meant that I learned quotes in pairs from the 2 different plays, so that when I did my essays I would literally just remember the quotes as pairs and would just put them in, and it meant that I had built-in analysis and comparison in my essays without even thinking about the bigger comparisons of the question itself. So yeah, those were super helpful. So now for context. Context comes into all of the papers and all of the different books. So how I did it is for most of them I just sort of wrote notes. So this is my Hamlet ones. And just as a little reminder, you don't just have to have specific facts about context, like little laws that happened during that time, but you can also talk about larger concepts, like the idea of a revenge tragedy, or the concept of kingship, and things like that are also context. So if you run out of specific things about the period to say, you can always talk about big genre ideas like a revenge tragedy and things like that. So yeah, I would do these, and the way that I made my notes was a combination of bits and bobs from class that we learned, but I also watched a few lectures on Masslit, which my school has a subscription to. So if you do have any sort of subscription to lectures of sorts, like a Masslit, which is a really good resource, do use those, or just go on YouTube and find some lectures. Those can be so helpful because I watched quite a few and learned some very niche bits of context that I did actually use in my exams, and I feel like definitely helped to sort of boost my essay a little bit more. And in terms of how I memorized context, it was very much just through using and reusing it in essay plans, like just write loads of essays, do loads of essay plans, and the quotes and the context and even the critics, which I'm going to talk next about, will just be learned without even trying. At least that's what happened for me, and I think that's the best way to do it. Now for critics. So critics is a very new thing in terms of English Lit A-level. You won't have used critics at GCSE, so it's very confusing at first to even understand what the use of them are. But I think with critics, they can be so helpful, because when you're stuck for an argument in an essay in an exam, sometimes using a critic to bounce off of can be really helpful in terms of forming an argument. And I loved using critics. So in terms of how to even start with memorizing critics and all that stuff, I would say just compile all the critics that you think you're going to use and will be versatile. Get critics that are not too specific so that you can use them for different themes and things like that, and different characters. So I first just would compile them all into an A4 list. So this was mine for Paradise Lost. And then once you've got this list, I put them on Quizlet flashcards with the critic name on one side and the critic quote on the other side, so that I'd flip them and test myself on both things. So sometimes I'd look at the quote and have to guess the critic name, or sometimes I would look at the critic name and have to guess the quote. So I can put the link to my Quizlet for my English critics, because you might not have some of the critics that I found. And yeah, make your own Quizlet flashcards or just physical flashcards, compile all the critics that you find. But just like with context, I think the main way that I actually memorized the critics were just by weaving them into my essay plans time and again, and that was the way that they definitely stuck most with me. Now onto the unseen paper. For me, I had to analyse an extract from prose and then analyse an extract of poetry. It's like a poem. But for the prose, we had a time frame that the prose could be from. So the extract could be from any book published between the years of 1880 to 1910. So if you have a similar thing, I think with that, I would say read loads of books from that time period. And this is just quite helpful because it means that you familiarise yourself with the style of writing and the genres and the literary archetypes that came up during that period, which can be really helpful. With the unseen paper, obviously you're not needing to memorize quotes or critics or anything like that, because the critics are provided for you for the prose. But the only thing that I did need to memorize was context for unseen context, and I did a similar thing with the other context that I did. I just created a sort of notes. Some people made timelines of the period, which was also quite good, but I just decided to make notes and split them up into the different themes of context. So like colonialism, science, psychology, gender, education, social class structure, industrial sector, crime, and there was a mixture of like specific facts in there. But I also made some notes on literary genres of the time period, because as I said, this is also context. So I made notes on like the Gothic genre, decadence period, realism, naturalism, and modernism. I can't even speak anymore. But yes, that's what I did for context. And then I think for unseen, the best revision that you can do is just practice. You don't know what's going to come up in the exam. That's the point. It's unseen, so just practicing loads and getting your timing right is obviously going to help the most. But a really quick specific tip I would give is for the prose extract. They give these like boxes of critics right at the bottom. Read those first before you read the prose extract, because the critics are going to give you a bit of direction to go into when you're reading and when you're thinking about your argument. Use the critics sort of to start that thought process rather than reading them at the end. Let those guide your reading essentially, and that was a tip that my teacher gave me, and I did it every time, flicked straight to the back, read those boxes, and then started, and I think it definitely made a difference. The last thing I want to talk about is general essay advice. English is such an essay heavy subject. Basically all you do is write essays, so if you get the essays, I think everything else will click into place, because the memorization honestly is less important than your actual writing style and exam technique when writing these essays. What I want to really hammer down is it's quality, not quantity. I was known in my English class for my very short essays. I don't know why, but I just really struggle to write a lot in the timing, and even my teachers knew this, and I was constantly told like just try to write more, and that was definitely a struggle even in the exams. As I said, for my poetry paper I ended up only writing half an essay for one of the essays, which I was really worried that it would impact my grade, but as I said, it didn't. And I think what I realised through doing so many mocks and exams for English is that even if you don't write loads, if what you have written is like very concise and you've got everything you need, it's okay. So don't worry about writing pages and pages, because I would look over and people would be writing like 6 pages for an essay, and I'd be there with my like 2 sides of A4, and it doesn't matter. In terms of my writing style, it was really concise and blunt, and I took out all the fancy language. It was quote with analysis in the same sentence, and then a critic, and then context, and it was just sort of one thing after another, and my argument interweaved throughout, and it was short, but it had everything it needed. So I did really quickly want to talk about that, the fact that it's quality over quantity. And then the other thing is to pay close attention to the mark schemes and the amount of marks that you get for each section in each essay. So for one essay like Hamlet, it was 20 marks for context and then 10 marks for everything else. But for the Plath and Hughes paper, it was 20 marks for AO2, which is like quotes and analysis, and then 10 marks for everything else. So be aware of which paper weighs more on which part of the mark scheme. So for example, do you need to include more context, or do you need to include more comparison, or do you need to include more quotes? It depends from essay to essay, and just make sure that you do what it's saying. So yeah, do pay attention to the mark scheme in terms of how much weight is placed on the different aspects. And then the final quick random tip that I would give is, if you can, put critics or context in the introduction of your essays as well. It just looks good to the examiner when you've already got some critics and context in your introduction, and it can really help your argument and general direction of the essay if you've already got some in the introduction. So yeah, that's it for my advice for English Literature A-level. I don't have a lot of advice for English, unfortunately. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I feel like English was the one subject that I didn't really struggle on very much. For psychology and history, I spent so much time like trying to get better, and for English I was just very lucky that it sort of always came quite easy to me. So I obviously did revise and work hard, but I think I didn't do as much as others did, and I definitely didn't do as much revision for this subject than I did my other 2 subjects. So yeah, this is everything that I did to revise for English, but listen to your own needs and your own ways of learning, and you might need to do something else to revise better, or maybe something that I did doesn't work for you. So yeah, bear that in mind when you do your own revision. But I hope that this gave you some ideas about how you can revise, and yeah, good luck with your English literature revision. I loved English, it was one of my favourite subjects, and I'm gonna miss it so much because I just love reading and analysing. But yes, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye. Mwah.